Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Churchill Library and Centre. My name is Michael Bishop, and I'm the Director of the Library and the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society. The Society was founded 50 years ago and is dedicated to preserving and promoting the historic legacy of Winston Churchill through publications and events, such as our upcoming 35th International Churchill Conference this weekend in Colonial Williamsburg. To learn more about Churchill and the Society, please visit us online at winstonchurchill.org. The National Churchill Library and Centre is the result of a partnership between the University and the Society, and over the last 2 years, we have welcomed many students and visitors and shared with them access to primary documents, books, and exhibits about Winston Churchill, including a painting by Churchill, which you can see over there. For our Churchill Conversations series, we welcome to the library leaders such as Ambassador Ron Dermer, David Rubenstein, General David Petraeus, former Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf, actor Gary Oldman, distinguished historians including Neil Ferguson, and many more, to discuss not only the particulars of Churchill's life and career, but their application to our present-day challenges. For as Churchill himself observed, the longer you can look back, the farther you can look forward. But now let us turn to the main event. Tonight we will learn about a figure utterly devoted to history, who in his 30s wrote an admiring biography of a conservative Victorian statesman, and who has chronicled the history of wars around the world. Amid a colossal output of nonfiction, in his youth he wrote a single novel featuring a protagonist modeled rather closely after himself and engaged in a struggle against tyranny. A passionate polemicist, his articles on a host of political and historical subjects appeared in newspapers and magazines in Britain and around the world. A fervent admirer of Napoleon, a devout drinker of Paul Roger champagne, a confidant of prime ministers and habitué of 10 Downing Street, and an honored guest at the White House, he has truly made his mark on history. One of the reasons, the many reasons, that Andrew Roberts may be the perfect biographer of Winston Churchill is that the above description applies equally to them both. In his...
I spotted that coming up, actually.
You should read the novel. In his...
Please don't.
That's what Churchill said about his. In his memoirs of the Second World War, Churchill reflected on the moment when ultimate power came to him in May 1940. I was conscious of a profound sense of relief. At last I had the authority to give directions over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. After decades of research, ceaseless travel in the great man's footsteps, and the use of new sources, Andrew Roberts has crafted a brilliant exploration of Churchill's walk with destiny. But it's not the new sources that most distinguish this path-breaking work. Rather, it is the calm and reasoned judgment that Andrew applies to the countless dramas, triumphs, failures, and controversies that marked Churchill's 9-decade life and 6-decade parliamentary career. Since its publication last month in Britain, Churchill, Walking with Destiny, has been declared the best single-volume life of Churchill ever written by both the Sunday Times and the Sunday Telegraph. And in the new issue of Finest Hour, the International Churchill Society's publication, reviewer John Campbell hailed it as a heroic biography. Andrew Roberts has a PhD from Cambridge University, is a visiting professor at the War Studies Department of King's College, London, the Lehrman Institute Distinguished Lecturer at the New York Historical Society, and the author of 13 books, including Eminent Churchillians, The Storm of War, Masters and Commanders, and Napoleon. He is a trustee of the Margaret Thatcher Archive Trust, the National Portrait Gallery, and of course, most importantly, the International Churchill Society. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Roberts.
Might it be possible to have a copy of the book here, displayed up there?
Oh yes,
Thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. It was displayed much better. Also, there's something I might draw attention to. Thank you.
So I mentioned in my introduction that you had used a great many new sources, and some might ask, how could there possibly be new sources after more than 1,000 biographies of Churchill that we found? Could you tell us about those?
Yes, there have been 1,009 biographies. So why on earth did I include 1,010 for the project? Over the last decade, an extraordinary cornucopia of new sources has opened up. Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. And King George VI gave an interview to an audience to Winston Churchill every Tuesday lunchtime of the Second World War. And then, wonderfully, went and wrote down everything that Churchill said. And so we have huge amounts of new information about his hopes and fears and aperçus and gags every Tuesday of the war. We also have 41, the relationship between the King and Churchill was a fascinating one. It need not have been very successful at the beginning. It could easily have gone wrong. Churchill, of course, had supported the King's elder brother during the abdication crisis, and the King had also very much been in favour of the policy of appeasement and had tried to stop Churchill from becoming Prime Minister. So it was it could have gone wrong, that relationship. Instead, it went magnificently right. And very quickly, the King was referring to Churchill by his Christian name. It was the first time he'd ever, it was the only one of his prime ministers, four prime ministers who he called by his Christian name, and they became firm friends. He uses the word friendship in the diaries. You also have 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at the Churchill College archives in Cambridge since the big last big biography of him, including Mary Solmes's 1940 diary. You have the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, 1932 to 43, who Churchill saw a lot of, especially during the Nazi-Soviet pact. You have the verbatim accounts of the war cabinet. Now, those have been discovered in the last 10 years. And also, there's another fascinating new, I'm trying to work out the best way to putting this. Pamela Harriman's love letters. Pamela Harriman, I'm very conscious of the fact we're on TV, led an active romantic life during the Second World War. So we have these love letters. She actually, and I was given exclusive access to them, she had love affairs with people all around Churchill who knew Churchill and wrote backwards and forwards to Churchill. So you have these letters from people like John Whitney, Ed Murrow, the great broadcaster. Of course, she had all the way through this time to Winston Churchill's son Randolph and baby by him. But also you get love letters from Bill Paley and from, of course, Admiral Harriman himself, who was the FDR's special envoy, head of the RAF, Sir Charles Portal, General Kenneth Anderson, and someone we just know of as Jerry. You put all these together and there is something new, something that won't have appeared, all of these new sources, on every page of my book.
You use these sources in your many, many years of experience researching Churchill to take readers along with Churchill on his walk with destiny. But this sense of destiny was present in him from a very early age. Can you tell us about that?
It's absolutely essential to understand him. From the age of 16, Winston Churchill, when he was at Harrow, Churchill was almost totally self-educated because he had to be, because he went to Harrow. He, at the age of 16, told a friend that there were going to be great struggles, huge upheavals in the world, that he was going to be called upon to save London and save the country and save the empire. And he said this at 16, and he believed it. And he acted out his life very much under that sense of self-belief, this sense of destiny. And as he went through life, and especially as he survived incredibly large number of brushes with death, his close brushes with death, I didn't go through them, but there were an enormous number. He believed as a result of the Almighty that there were what he called invisible wings that were flapping over him and protecting him. And although when you look into the role of the Almighty in Churchill's theology, it seems to have mainly been designed just simply to take care of Mr. Churchill.
One of the most extraordinary things about Churchill becoming Prime Minister in May 1940 was that he survived long enough to reach that office. You mentioned just a minute ago his various scrapes and near misses. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay, well, let's go through them. I'll try and keep them roughly chronological. He was born 2 months premature. He was stabbed in the stomach by a penknife when he was at prep school, age 10. Aged 11, he had very serious pneumonia, probably the closest he ever came to death. And his doctors administered brandy to him, both orally and rectally. You would have thought that might have put you off brandy for life, ladies and gentlemen, but in Churchill's case it certainly didn't. He survived a near drowning on Lake Geneva, a house fire. Of course, he fought in 5 wars on 4 continents. In the First World War, he went into the trenches, into no man's land, 30 times, which he didn't need to do as a battalion commander, commanding the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, but he did. Got so close to the German trenches that he could hear the Germans speaking in them. It was, he survived 2 plane crashes, 3 car crashes, and this here, the reason that I brought this in, apart from obviously to encourage you to buy it, is to show you this livid scar down the centre of his forehead, which came as a result of his car crash in 5th Avenue in New York in December 1931. And it didn't stop with the war either. When the war started, he continued to take extraordinary risks, again and again, especially during the Blitz. And he also had a minor heart attack when he was lifting a sash window at the White House in 1941, and also he got a series of pneumonia later on in his life. And in Carthage, in the May of 1943, he had a very serious bout. His doctor asked him to provide some blood, and Churchill said, well, I can give you some from my finger or from my ear, and I also have an almost infinite expansive arse.
So when we think of Churchill, most of us think about this fierce bulldog image on the cover, but one of the things that you discovered in your research is that Churchill was remarkably lachrymose, even when he held the highest office.
He absolutely was. He was a profoundly passionate and emotional man, much more than I was expecting actually. He burst into tears 50 times during the Second World War. It must be very off-putting to have your leader suddenly just burst into tears in the House of Commons. Like, if Theresa May suddenly burst into tears, I think it would be very off-putting, well, she's got every right to. I would put this down to the fact that he was not a buttoned-up Tory, stiff-upper lip aristocrat of the late Victorian age into which he was born, but much more that he was a throwback to an earlier era, an era he loved, that of the Regency aristocracy, people who wore their heart on their sleeve very much more than the Victorians did.
As long as we're on the subject of Churchill's emotions, I think we should deal with, as you do in your book, this perception on the part of many that Churchill was depressive or manic depressive,
yes,
or something along those
lines. Yes, I don't believe that's the case at all. Certainly not bipolar, as some of the books have said. No, he got depressed, undoubtedly. He got depressed through the time of the Dardanelles catastrophe in the First World War, which had led to the killing or wounding of 160,000 Allied troops, which he had entirely supported right from the beginning all the way through to the end. He got depressed at the time of the fall of Singapore in February 1942 and the fall of Tobruk in June 1942. But these are times really when anyone would have got depressed. And depression is a debilitating illness, and it can attack at any time. And he was able to chair over 1,000 meetings of the Cabinet of the Defence Committee at any time, day and night, until 3 a.m. in the morning sometimes. And that's not remarkably depressive. Neither was he an alcoholic. again, he did drink an enormous amount. C.P. Scott said that Winston Churchill couldn't be an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. And when you look at the amount that he drank, you have to remember that he had an ox-like constitution. And of the 2,174 days of the Second World War, there's only one day that people around him said that he was drunk. And on that occasion they ignored everything that had been decided that night and had precisely the same meeting the next morning when he'd sobered up, and so no decisions were taken on the back of his drinking. But I very much came to the conclusion by the end of researching this book that that in his words, of course, were correct when he said that alcohol was that he'd taken more out of alcohol than alcohol had taken out of him.
You very firmly established in this book and in your comments now that Churchill was neither a depressive nor a drunk. But when you look at his parents and how they treated him, you might not blame him for either of those afflictions. Can you tell us about his parents, especially his father's treatment?
Yes, I think some of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a brilliant, mercurial, disdainful, aloof figure who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer and one of the great orators in English politics. And he never spotted any part of brilliance in his own son. Instead, he lambasted him. Some of the most moving letters are the letters that, in this book, are the letters from Churchill begging really for love and affection from his parents. His mother was born in Brooklyn, of course, and yet she seemed to take on the English Victorian attitude towards children. When Winston was 10 years old, she wrote everything that she did in her diary in 1884, and she only saw her son 6.5 hours out of 6 months. And he said, Churchill said that he felt that she was, and wrote in his brilliant autobiography, My Early Life, that he felt that she was like the evening star, in that she shone brilliantly, but at a distance. And that obviously had a deep psychological effect on him. But the effect, and that she showed no interest in him until he became a signatory on her trust fund. At which point, suddenly, she actually started to be extremely helpful and nice to him. But with regard to the father, after the father's death, in 1894, at the age of 45, when Churchill was 20, Churchill proved his love, sort of almost obsession with his father. He wrote his father's 2-volume biography. He searched out all his father's friends. He adopted his father's political stance of Benjamin Disraeli's Tory democracy. He adopted his father's actual speaking stance of putting his hand on his head. He called his son Randolph. And then when he finally made some money, basically Winston Churchill was in the red until his early 70s. And then finally he had some cash to spend because he'd written his war memoirs. He did a very Regency thing, which was to spend it on the first of 37 racehorses. And he put the jockeys of the racehorses into his father's pink and chocolate racing cars.
Churchill fought and rode his way all over the world, and time and again he displayed a kind of extraordinary, even reckless courage that many of his contemporaries were just amazed at. He said later that courage is the first of human qualities because it's the quality that guarantees all the others. You, of course, tell us a great deal about Churchill's courage in your book. Could you discuss that and how that was important to his career and his ultimate success?
Yes, and the physical courage was manifest from very early on. He charged, of course, with the 21st Lancers at the Battle of Omdurman, where his units lost 25% casualties. The following year, his train was ambushed in the Boer War, and they lost 34% casualties. And a couple of months after that, he escaped from a prisoner of war camp and made his way across 300 miles of enemy territory to escape. He was a man compounded of courage, and you saw this was very much a preparation for this hour and this trial, because you saw it again in the Second World War, when as a Prime Minister, he travelled 110,000 miles outside of the UK in those 5 years of being Prime Minister, wartime Prime Minister. And he went in planes across the Atlantic, one of which got struck by lightning, and if the instrumentation had failed, he'd been killed. He went across the Atlantic, of course, with U-boats in the area where they had to move constantly be changing direction to avoid U-boats. He flew in unpressurized cabins at the age of his late 60s and early 70s in areas that were being patrolled by the Luftwaffe. And so it was, and with several planes that he had been in were shot down the next day, or ones that were coming to him were shot down. It was a tremendous thing. He needed to do it because he was the glue that kept the big three together. Stalin refused to fly and only left Russia once during the Second World War. Of course, FDR was profoundly disabled, and although he did go to several of the conferences, it really took Churchill to go all the way to Moscow twice and so on, in order to be the glue that kept the big three together.
As his walk with destiny entered the 1930s, he became one of the first at least, high-level, prominent political leaders in Britain to spot the danger of Hitler. Why him? What about his background and experience helped him perceive what so many others could not?
Well, I think there were three things. I think firstly he was a Philo-Semite. Unlike many of his background and class and age, he liked Jews. He'd grown up with Jews, he'd gone on holiday with Jews, his father had liked Jews. He thought the Jews gave the ethics to world civilization, and he felt comfortable around Jews. And so he had an early warning system for Hitler and the Nazis and what they were genuinely like, in a way that a lot of other British upper-class people who were anti-Semitic just simply didn't have. The next thing was that he was a historian, and so he was able to place, and a historian of his own great ancestor, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, who, and he wrote a 4-volume biography of his great ancestor, who had, of course, prevented the hegemonization of the continent by Louis XIV in the War of Spanish Succession. So he was able to place Hitler in the long continuum of people who needed to be stopped on the continent, starting with Philip II of Spain at the time of the Armada, going on to Louis XIV, then to Napoleon, and then obviously to the Kaiser. And so he was able to see Hitler in the historical perspective. And the last reason was that he had come up close to fanaticism in his own life in a way that very few other prime ministers of the 1930s ever had. He had seen it in the Northwest frontier, he'd seen it in the Sudan, he'd seen, in this case, Islamic fundamentalist fanaticism. And he spotted it again. He spotted the same traits in the Nazis and Hitler. And this was something that was simply not vouchsafed to people like Neville Chamberlain or Stanley Baldwin or Ramsay MacDonald, none of whom had seen anything like that kind of fanaticism in their lives.
Once his walk with destiny concluded and he became Prime Minister in May 1940, one of his most potent weapons was, of course, his rhetoric and his famous speeches, especially in the early part of his premiership, which many of us know, some of us know by heart. Tell us about where this rhetorical power came from and the influences that went into it, including perhaps William Shakespeare.
Yes, I do recommend the Shakespeare exhibition, the Churchill Shakespeare exhibition. Was it notes? Yes, it's Shakespeare, good. I'm glad I got that right. That's at the Folger Library at the moment, which concentrates on the extent to which William Shakespeare and Churchill's love of Shakespeare from a very early age and his learning of great reams of Shakespeare affected Churchill's oratorical technique. But actually, even at the age of 23, Churchill had written an article called The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, which explains the 5 things you need to do in order to be able to capture an audience in a public speech. And at that point, so it was entirely theory, because at that point he had never given a public speech himself. And so he took it from the theory into the practice. He then travelled tens of thousands of miles up and down the country to give speeches all over the country as a young budding politician. And he was able, therefore, to put his theories into practice in a completely brilliant way. He had a problem in that he wasn't a natural speaker. He had a sibilant S. He had to work incredibly hard at it. But he knew how important it was, and so he did put in the hours necessary. And he was, in 1940, one of his private secretaries asked him what the secret to his great wartime speeches were. And he said that you needed to keep words short, you needed to work out for yourself what you wanted to say and keep total clarity of the message, and you needed to keep sentences short, and if possible, use words from Old English, which would naturally sort of appeal to the people listening to it in the English language. And when you look at the 141-word preparation of his "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech, which of course talks about we shall fight with growing confidence in the air, and ends, we shall never surrender. Of those 141 words, all but 2 of them come from the Old English. Of those 2, confidence, the word confidence comes from the Latin, and surrender comes from the French.
Indeed. Churchill's rhetoric was, of course, a formidable weapon, but he was also a war leader who commanded what became ultimately a vast war effort. One of the things that marked it out from the beginning was his determination to coordinate. Can you talk about the lessons that he derived from his earlier experiences in the First World War and in other conflicts that he brought to 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister in May 1940?
Yes, and I mentioned about the horror of the Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles, where 160,000 Allied casualties were suffered. And he ensured that he was never again going to be in a position where that was going to happen, because he was never in the Second World War to overrule the Chiefs of Staff in the way that he had overruled the Admiralty in the Great War. And so he never once did in the whole of the war. So he was a politician who learned lessons, learned from his mistakes, and also, of course, he knew that he had made endless errors all the way through his life. He'd got so many things wrong. He got women's suffrage wrong, he got the gold standard wrong, he got the abdication crisis wrong, he got the primarily, of course, Gallipoli wrong, and many others. And so he was a genius, but he was a flawed genius, and he knew that, and he also knew that he had to learn from his mistakes. In fact, he told his wife Clementine, "I should have made nothing if I had not made mistakes."
Tell us, since you mentioned Clementine, tell us about Clementine Churchill and how important she was to him. They were married for a very, very long time.
She was central, absolutely central to his existence. She gave him some of the best advice that he had through his career. She told him not to come out of the trenches too early in the First World War, which was a very difficult piece of advice to tell him, because of course he was taking these risks and going off into the trench raiding. And she knew that, and yet she also knew that he would never be happy in life if he spoiled the reputation that he had by returning too early. In June 1940, she writes him a marvellous letter telling him not to be so beastly to the staff and be nicer to the private secretaries and the stenographers and the secretaries and the rest of it, because he was just being too egotistical and bullying and really difficult. And that seems to have worked, at least at the moment. He always thought of her as his rock, and depended on her enormously. And the wonderful thing about her is that she was an aristocratic battle axe, basically, and she could be so rude to his political enemies. And you certainly didn't want to get on the wrong side of Clementine Churchill when she was in full swing. And there's a marvellous letter that she writes to Henry Asquith, Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister in 1915, in which she tells him that he needs to employ Churchill and not let him leave the Admiralty. And although he got nowhere and got her nowhere, and the Ascus were rather sniffy about the letter. Actually, when you read it today, you would be so proud as a man to have a wife who could write a letter like that. Absolutely magnificent. Actually, I've got a wife who could write a letter like that.
I strongly suspect that we have a very large number of questions from the audience, and so I think we will turn to that now. If you do have a question, please raise your hand. Anyone? We've got one over there. We've got a microphone that will come to you in just a second. Lady in red back there. There we are.
Hello, thank you very much. Nietzsche Quadzel, Voice of America, Eurasian Service. I have a very specific question. So, the question of the Caucasus and the British withdrawal was in a way debated between Lord Curzon and Churchill. So could you expand on that? What role did Churchill have in this? And I mean, like after the First World War, the withdrawal of the UK from the region. Thank you.
Yes, it was the question really in September and October 1922 that brought down the Lloyd George government, and it was really went to the heart of what the British Empire was going to be about, because the government, Lloyd George and Churchill and others, wanted to ensure that Turkey stuck to the provisions of the Sèvres Treaty, and which were very harsh on Turkey, and the Turks weren't going to do it. And it was, if people had supported the government, we would have possibly gone to war with Turkey, which nobody wanted to do 4 years after the end of the Great War. And so others, such as Andrew Bonar-Law, really brought down the government in order to prevent this from happening. So were we going to be a continuingly pugnacious imperial power, the policeman of the world, as Bonar-Law put it in a letter to the Times, or were we going to stand back and effectively accept that we were going to be a declining power? And the what was called the Carlton Club meeting on the 19th of October 1922 made it clear that it was going to be the latter.
Gentleman in the bow tie, Churchillian bow tie.
Hi. Thank you for coming, sir. Thank you, Michael, for doing this, and everyone at the Churchill Center. In Christopher Andrews' book, To Defend the Realm, is a history of MI5. One of the things that struck me was that Churchill, the impression I had was that Churchill was almost fighting a two-front war in the run-up to him becoming prime minister, that he was concerned with the rise of fascism, but he was also concerned about the rise of communism at the same time, and no one wanted, it was almost, in some circles, in some policy circles, it seems like it was an either or. And I just wondered if your book speaks to him trying to address that and get people to take it seriously.
Oh, absolutely. Chapter after chapter does. It's from the Bolshevik Revolution onwards, he was a convinced anti-communist. But by the late 1930s, certainly by 1939, he believed that it was essential to get the Soviet Union into a defensive pact in order to stop Hitler, which of course had many problems, not least because the Poles were essential to this, but they quite rightly feared and despised the Russians as much as the Germans. So it was a really complicated geostrategic decision that Churchill took to embrace the Soviet Union, which he had been denouncing for the previous decade and a bit. He did it partly with the help of Ivan Maisky, the ambassador. So we now do have new information about the extent to which he was doing this, and there is a chance that you mentioned the Christopher Andrew book, which is the substantial biography of MI5. There's a chance that he was being bugged by MI5 because they obviously needed to know what was being said between him and Maisky. It's a pretty grey area, of course, like everything else in the intelligence world. But Nothing came of it, of course, ultimately, because the Nazi-Soviet Pact in August 1939 managed to leapfrog anything that the national government were able to do.
Question? Yes, ma'am.
With this much material to choose from, I'm curious how you decided what not to include, and is there anything you didn't include in your book that you could share with us tonight?
The lady standing at the back there in the blue is Joyce Manil, who was my editor, and she knows better than anybody in the world what we did and what we didn't include. Basically, it could have been 10 times bigger, couldn't it? Yeah.
Stretched it to the limit of the binding.
I said, stretched to the limit of the binding. And you have to do that because there is just so much to say about Churchill. But the real problem I found in writing this book was what to cut out. It was condensation. The whole time one had to condense. And sometimes it's like chopping off your little finger. You would have gone off to an archive, you would have found a beautiful nugget that you're very proud of, and then you just don't have space for it. And it's a horrible feeling, but you've just got to do it, because otherwise you're either forced into 2 volumes, which doesn't sell anything like so well, or you have something that if you drop it on your toe, it would break your leg. But I think with this one, I hope you'll agree with this one, although it is, it's got right at the end are about 150 pages of notes, bibliography and index you don't have to worry about. The actual bit that's the meaty part is under 1,000 pages. Actually, it's 18 pages under 1,000 pages.
Could you talk about the modern case against Churchill and how you consider it but a feather on the scale of history?
Yes, no, this is very important, especially since the internet. The attacks on Churchill have become ever more, frankly, weird. But I saw the other day about your astronaut, Scott Kelly. The UN ambassador to space. Only the United Nations would send an ambassador to a place that hasn't got a government or people that done that. This man said that he quoted Churchill saying in Victory Magnanimity, and in a tweet, and he got an enormous number of Twitter trolls saying that Churchill was a racist and a colonialist and a war criminal and all this kind of thing. And all the old canards came up, the gassing of the Iraqi tribesmen, etc., which, let me just point out, ladies and gentlemen, it's very clear when you go to the original documents, he was talking about tear gas, he was not talking about mustard gas, he actually made that clear in the letter. Again and again, with these things, you just need to go back to the original sources, or what Mr. Kelly should have done is just educate himself about Churchill. Instead, he put out a tweet saying that he was very sorry that he should have said anything in favour of this evil, racist, warmonger. And then he got all the pro-Churchill people tweeting him. I really do think, though, that the space that Mr. Kelly should have concentrated on really is the one between his ears.
In America, for about 30 years after the war, there was this portrait of a grand alliance and everybody had gotten along. And then more and more the book started to point out the shameful way that Franklin Roosevelt treated Winston Churchill.
Is my personal opinion, maybe someone will troll me, but the question I guess is, do you have any sense of how he personally felt about the way he was treated at Yalta and Tehran and so forth?
Yes, I think it's too harsh, very, very much too harsh to say that it was shameful. I think FDR put American best interests first, which is the duty of an American president. So I don't think that because they didn't go to war against Russia, which you'd had to have done in order to impose the agreement made at Yalta, that FDR can be accused of that. He did pivot from the Tehran conference onwards towards trying to make sure that there was a long-term arrangement with the Russians, which of course came to grief at Yalta. But what happened at Yalta really was that Stalin lied all the way through about the integrity and independence of Poland. And you still had over 1 million Russian boots on Polish soil. And without going to war with Russia, it seems very difficult to work out how on earth anything could have been done about that. And so it was a terrible moment when, by March 1946, and the Iron Curtain speech at Fulton, Missouri, Churchill was the first person, just as brave as anything he said in the 1930s, he got just as much obloquy for it as a result, came out and said that Soviet communism under Stalin was going to be a scourge. And so, of course, by that stage, FDR was dead. But that you're right in saying, where I think you're right, is saying that from the autumn of 1944 onwards, the close, friendly, relaxed working relationship between the two men had broken down. And there are over 300 more letters, I think it's 342, more letters from Winston Churchill to Franklin Roosevelt than there are replies from Roosevelt to Churchill. So maybe that's what you're referring to when you use the word shameful.
Yes, ma'am. I just wait for 1 second. We'll bring the microphone for you.
Could you explain Churchill's relationship with our presidents post-World War II? I was under the impression that they shared our national intelligence information with him when he was in, because he returned back as prime minister. So I'm pretty sure Truman and Eisenhower both, and probably Kennedy, both sent him our national security information.
Not Kennedy, but...
Not Kennedy, but Truman and Eisenhower.
Yes.
And I wanted to just point out that in your Imperial War Museum, you only have one book on General Montgomery, and it's comparing him with Rommel. And could you expand upon his relationship with General Montgomery?
Well, first of all, the Imperial War Museum has undertaken this terrible disbursement of books. They've sold their library, basically. It's one of the great historical tragedies. And that's why they only have one book. If you'd asked that question 5 years ago, there would have been well over 300 books in the Imperial War Museum on Montgomery. His relationship with Montgomery was subject to fluctuations. He admired him very much at the beginning, made him a field marshal very early on in 1944 to the fury of Patton and Omar Bradley and various other people who wanted to be five-star generals at the time of the world. He then thought that Monty got too big for his boots, which Monty most definitely had. He then befriended Monty in the interwar period, in the post-war period, and then to a great degree, when Monty, I think Monty went round to Chartwell, stayed at Chartwell or had lunch at Chartwell 78 times in the course of the post-war membership, and then he fell out with Monty again. So they were like two, as he said of his relationship with General Smuts, they were like two old birds pecking each other. But they ultimately, of course, there was a great deal of respect and admiration. Was there a first part of the question I forgot? Sorry. Oh, I see. Yes, no. Well, of course, he like everybody else, Churchill liked Dyke. But he actually wanted Adlai Stevenson to win the 1952 election. And he was nerve-wracked because he thought that Eisenhower wasn't going to pursue the policy of nuclear appeasement that he wanted to pursue towards the Russians after the Russians exploded their nuclear bomb in April 1949. At that point, the great anti-communist, anti-Soviet Winston Churchill, who of course had been pro-Soviet during the war and then anti-Soviet in 1946 at the time of the Iron Curtain speech, then went pro again because he saw that British interests were not best served by having a heavily nuclearized Soviet Union, and thought that Eisenhower would not address that, whereas Democrats might.
Yes, sir. We have a microphone here.
Thank you also for coming here. It's been a real treat. And having read your book on Halifax many, many years ago, and I can't wait to read your book on Churchill. You probably get this question a lot since The Darkest Hour came out in the movie. And now being an expert, obviously, on both the leading characters in that. What is your take on the movie? Do you think that the artistic license that they took was necessary to get the story out to a wider audience? I'm just curious as your thoughts.
Thank you very much for reading my first book, the Holy Fox biography of Halifax. I wrote it 30 years ago. Since when I've written 5 other books for Churchill in the title or subtitle. I really feel as though I was walking destiny and that all my past life has been a preparation for this hour, this trial. I loved the film. I thought it was great. I loved Gary Oldman's prosthetics. I loved the sort of glint in the eye and the chortle. I thought he called Churchill absolutely brilliantly. The problem I had with it was that it actually detracted from the true leadership that was shown by Winston Churchill in May 1948, the issue of Making Peace with Adolf Hitler, where he did not go down into the subway and treat and ask a focus group of people what he wanted to do, what he should do. Neither was he visited by the king in his bedroom at midnight. That didn't happen either. And so, as a result, you actually have a detraction from the extraordinary leadership that he did show. He decided that he was going to outmaneuver Lord Halifax. He didn't go to MPs. He went to the wider cabinet. He put forward, well, it's all in chapter 21 of my book. It was a campaign to ensure, especially of course once we got 250,000 troops back from Dunkirk by the 28th of May, that these negotiations were never going to go anywhere. And it's absolutely, it's one of those pivotal moments in history that if Halifax had been Prime Minister, if Neville Chamberlain continued as Prime Minister and had supported Halifax, we could have gone down a very, very dangerous path if we'd made peace with Hitler then. Because he would have then been able to have, instead of using 50 to 70% of the Luftwaffe on Operation Barbarossa, the attack on Russia on the 22nd of June 1941, he'd have been able to have used it all. And when you think that he got to, in the north he got to subject Leningrad to a grueling 1,000-day siege, and in the center he got to the subway stations of Moscow, and in the south he actually captured Stalingrad. What he'd have been able to have done if he had the whole Luftwaffe, twice as many planes, is terrifying to consider, especially without America being in the war at the time.
Right back there.
I was wondering if you could talk about Churchill's role in the attack on the French at Mers el-Kabir.
Very good question. Yes, it was something that almost broke his heart. He was a Francophile to the end. He loved France, always had done. But when it became clear that actually nothing was terribly clear about he put it Oran as well, Mers el-Kabir and Oran. Nothing was terribly clear because although we were intercepting the French naval signals, they weren't always being done in real time and also not completely successfully. So Churchill believed that the French fleet was not going to scupper itself. This is, of course, the Vichy fleet that was in the Algerian port of Mers el-Kabir or Oran. But was actually going to try and fight it out and take on Admiral Sir James Somerville's force. And so Churchill had to take this grindingly painful decision, especially, of course, as the this was on the 3rd of July 1940, only 2 weeks before the Germans had marched into Paris, of not just setting back any hope for close Anglo-French cooperation, but also killing 3,000, as it turned out. 3,000, sorry, no, it was more. Sorry, 12, yes, nearly 1,300, 1,299 French soldiers. And so he took that decision. It was one that he never regretted. And one of the reasons was that it sent the message to the world, and especially here to the United States, that we were going to fight on, come what may. If you sink the French fleet and they were your allies only 2 weeks beforehand, it's clear that you're not about to give up and make peace with Hitler.
Very good question. Can you discuss the reaction of the Commons?
Well, the House of Commons, of course, cheered Churchill to the echo. He cried, as he so often did, as I mentioned earlier. But he hated doing it and said so. But nonetheless, it was the first victory we'd had for some time. And of course, actually, the other thing is the Royal Navy itself split between the officers who had who knew other French officers, and they'd been on each other's ships and trained with each other and knew each other and liked each other, who were devastated by having to kill so many Frenchmen. And then the able seamen who just thought that there was something straight out of Trafalgar and Nelson, and absolutely didn't mind in the slightest.
We have a couple more questions. This young man right here.
Again, I just want to say thank you for being here. My question is, what are your thoughts as to why he was not reelected right after the war? Do you think maybe because when the war ended, people saw him as a symbol of the old order, he was an imperialist, and they wanted to basically start anew?
Yes, that's one aspect of it. It came as a terrible shock when he lost the 1945 general election on the 26th of July. He was he expected to win because he'd been on one after the other of these election tours where he'd been cheered to the echo, especially in the northern and Midlands towns. But of course his name was only on one ballot, whereas a lot of Conservatives who'd been appeasers, their names were on the others. And people wanted, after 6 years of devastating war, wanted to have a more, well, they wanted nationalisation, they wanted the National Health Service, they wanted the welfare state and the Beveridge Report put into operation. And they knew that it was going to be Labour, Conservative Labour Party, that would do that with gusto. Whereas, although Churchill did offer to do most of that, he would not do it with anything like the same conviction. And that's essentially what... I mean, he also made an incredibly stupid remark during the election, where he attempted to equate Attlee's Labour Party with the Gestapo, which was an extremely stupid thing to have done, and probably also lost us a few seats.
I think we have time for one more question, sir.
Of all the Churchill biograpers out there, how were you able to convince the Queen to give you unfettered access to her father's diaries?
It was. I'd love to pretend it was anything other than serendipity. I didn't take no for an answer, and I kept asking, which I think is always very sensible with the Royal Archives. Also, it's been 17 plus years since the events, and so I think that it was pretty much time. But of course, that's a decision to be taken between her and Sir Christopher Guise, her private secretary. So luckily, they came to the decision that I was going to get a yes rather than yet another no. But as I say, I'd love to pretend it was archival genius. It wasn't at all.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite all of you to join us here on Monday, November 26th, when we welcome Sir Anthony Beaver, who will discuss his new History of the Battle of Arnhem. That's November 26th at noon. And now, I hope that you will take your own personal walk with destiny over to the bookstore and ensure the education and the future of Andrew's children by buying books, remembering that the holidays are just around the corner. And please allow Andrew to make a dash to the signing table over there, where he will be only too happy to give you his autograph. Thank you for being here tonight, and Andrew Roberts, thank you.